Thank you very much for inviting me to host. My name is Candida Rifkind. I am a professor in the Department of English at the University of Winnipeg in Manitoba. This is session 1A, Violence, War, and Displacement. I'm going to begin with a land acknowledgement, and then I will invite our first speaker to present. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Amy Barlow, is unable to present today, so we'll be hearing from Biz Naidam and Petros Tsakaliadis. So before I begin, I want to acknowledge that Winnipeg, where I am, is in Treaty 1 territory, and it's located on the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. But I would like even more precisely to locate myself today in my home downtown Winnipeg. I'm less than 1 block away from a fountain that celebrates the completion of the aqueduct that provides the city with fresh drinking water from Shoal Lake, which is a lake about 300 kilometers east of here on the Manitoba-Ontario border. That Shoal Lake 40 First Nation itself remains under a boil water advisory and has been under one for over 20 years, is a reminder of the inequities and injustices that defines our relationship to the land and the water and the infrastructures that run on, under, and through the land and water. So I'd like us to keep that in mind, especially for this topic on violence, war, and displacement, because of course, for those of us located in Canada, violence, war, and displacement have been fundamental to the founding of our nation. Our first presenter is Elizabeth Biz Naidam. Biz is an assistant professor without review in the Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. She is also a Shirk postdoctoral fellow at the University of Waterloo, working on her book manuscript titled Graphic Historiography, East German Memory Discourses in Comics and Graphic Novels, and that's under contract with Ohio State University Press. Biz's research and teaching interests include the representation of history in comics, comics and new media on forced migration, exploring intersections between Indigenous studies and German and European studies, and feminist methodologies in the graphic arts. Biz also sits on the executive committee of the International Comic Arts Forum, ICAF, and the executive board of the Comic Studies Society, CSS. And the title of Biz's talk today is The Smartphone and Social Media Aesthetics of Forced Migration, Comics on the Refugee Crisis. Take it away, Biz.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I would also like to begin with a land acknowledgement, since, as we've all noted, that we're gathering from different places across Canada and the globe. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm virtually gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I'm finding that these kind of online events and the lack of physical presence in our virtual meetings makes the importance of place all the more palpable. So I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the historic and contemporary caretakers on the land on which I work, learn, and teach. And in light of recent events and the discovery of 250 children at the residential school in Kamloops that we've all been talking a lot about here in Canada, I think it's important to be continually acknowledging where we're at in our relationship to the land on which we're doing our scholarship. So thank you everyone for joining us today. It is my honor to return to CSS after 6 years, I think. When I was opening up my folders, it said last CSSC conference was in 2015. So it's my honor to return as the first presenter on the program, which makes me feel a little uncomfortable, like I'm setting a bar. Don't let me set a bar. I began this research that I'm presenting today in late 2019, and it examines the way in which new media are intervening in the representation of global forced migration, looking particularly at the role of comics, digital games, and social media in the narrativization and remediation of refugee experience. The part of that larger project that I'm presenting today is in the final stages of revision and will be published in Crossings Journal of Migration and Culture in early fall 2021, fingers crossed. And actually, this project started as part of a talk I gave at the University of Waterloo on Reinhard Kleist's An Olympic Dream, which is the second of my 2 examples. So Paul Malone, who is here with us today, will be familiar with some of the material, and I look forward to his feedback on how far this work has come. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and then confirm that I've been successful at sharing my screen. How does that look, everybody? Can I get some thumbs up? Thank you. So, comics on migration are not new. After all, even Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's Superman, the comic book franchise most associated with the form, began with the flight from Krypton. However, over the last decade, there has been renewed interest in representing migrant experience, namely that of refugees and asylum seekers in comics and graphic novels. Since 2011 in particular, and the start of the Syrian civil war, comics and graphic novels have become an essential forum for the representation of global forced migration. These so-called refugee comics range from newspaper comic strips, web comics and graphic novels, to pro-refugee infographics and anti-refugee propaganda. However, as Candida Rifkin notes, this category of comics is typically drawn by Western cartoonists based on testimonies by migrants and refugees or their work with them. They are therefore typically, and also not unproblematically, not about refugees, but about refugees. Yet while questions on the power relations embedded in the production of these texts remain, comics on global forced migration are still an important avenue for the representation of migrant hardships. Written from the subjective perspective of refugees, artists, and volunteers working in the community, these stories foster empathy and compassion for the plight of migrants internationally by giving voice to countless nameless and often faceless migrants whose images circulate widely in the news media. Offering a new avenue to thematize issues facing refugees, asylum seekers, and displaced people, these comics promote awareness of the Syrian emergency and the forced migration of many others living in conflict zones in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, with a number of these projects emerging in collaboration with human rights organizations. Moreover, comic artists working on refugee and migrant subjects are inventing new strategies to communicate these individuals' perilous journeys from war-torn regions of the world to European soil, illuminating issues on the presentation of refugee experience and news reporting through the formal characteristics of the comics medium. In addition to engaging discourses of photojournalism and human rights activism through the incorporation of photographic imagery and by virtue of the subjects and geographies thematized, these texts have begun to engage the new media technologies most important to the process of migration itself, demonstrating an essential shift in the visual language of both comics and refugee experience. This presentation examines the integration of forced migration's most essential tool, the smartphone, into the representation of that experience. Looking to two particularly inventive examples of comics mobilizing the iconicity and aesthetics of the smartphone, Kate Evans' Threads from the Refugee Crisis and Reinhard Kleist's An Olympic Dream, the story of Samia Yusuf Omar. This presentation assesses the importance of the incorporation of new media into the recounting of migrant experience, revealing an essential intervention in the visual regime of migrant imagery through the lens of mobility studies. Simply cataloging the number of instances smartphones appear in comics on forced migration is already a testament to the importance of these objects during the migration journey. However, I'm more interested in how artists have begun to weave mobile devices into the aesthetic language of their work. Developing a new aesthetics of migration through the visual modalities of the smartphone and social media, refugee comics draw attention to the politics of migrant mobility through the artistic mobilization of the primary technology that facilitates it. In this context, shifting the focus from migration studies discourses to mobility studies perspectives is particularly important in illuminating the significance of smartphone representations in refugee experience. Like migration studies, mobility studies is a discipline that explores human movement. However, migration studies is often preoccupied with immobile notions such as boundaries, borders, territory, landscapes, and geography, with its concern primarily on movement occurring between places and therefore foregrounding cities or nations as sites of departure or arrival. Exploring forced migration through the lens of mobility studies, on the other hand, centers both embodied human experience of the migrant journey, as well as the role of media representations in its shared meaning making. So even though understanding physical movement is also an important part of understanding mobility, examining movement alone does not illuminate what migrant mobility means or how it's practiced. Exploring migration through the lens of mobility thus incorporates the meanings and practice of migration through its entanglement with representation. While for most people, mobile devices primarily function to blur the lives and livelihoods of their users, the role of the smartphone in migrants and refugee communities is much more complex, with its utility and mobilization shifting constantly. However, looking to the role of mobile phones in the context of forced migration reveals a lot about its processes. According to a 2016 study, smartphones and social media networks provide lifelines for refugees on their journeys to Europe. 84% of the population of the Middle East and North Africa make use of a smartphone, and 84% of Syrian refugee households in Lebanon, for example, rely on WhatsApp to communicate with friends, family, and volunteers. Users send messages, voice recordings, and video recordings around the globe in seconds, informing their loved ones of their current location and well-being. Furthermore, smartphones and social media are essential in crowdsourcing information en route. Migrants share maps, contacts, and advice in public and private groups. Facebook in particular is used to crowdsource information in both private and public groups. While refugees often connect to Facebook to communicate with family and friends, they also use it as a forum to connect with influential figures in their social media networks, from prominent respected activists and NGOs to investigative journalists, political commentators, public intellectuals, and participants in controversial debates. With access to reliable news and trusted information in perpetual struggle, migrants often turn to news shared by respected friends and family through social media for information. Younger generations specifically consider information relayed through social media trustworthier than news distributed through traditional media. And when mobile phones are lost or damaged, Facebook accounts enable a permanent, if intermittent, perpetual presence. The portability of smartphones set these devices apart from previous communication tools and has resulted in a new kind of migration experience premised on perpetual connectivity. With refugees often arriving on European soil with only a smartphone, anxious to find a place to recharge it, these mobile devices have become foundational in shaping the movement of migrants, helping them navigate unfamiliar territory through wayfinding apps and creating a kind of digital passage to Europe. For refugees seeking to reach Europe, the digital infrastructure of social media, news and refugee-oriented apps, and Google Maps is therefore just as important as the physical infrastructure of roads, railways, sea crossings, and the borders controlling the free movement of people. Turning to refugee comics, in which smartphone technologies play a significant role, Kate Evans' Threads from a Refugee Crisis from 2017 and Reinhard Kleist's An Olympic Dream, the story of Samia Yusuf Omar, set themselves apart. Threads recounts Evans' experiences volunteering in the Calais jungle, the largest, though unofficial, refugee encampment in France, which operated during the peak of the quote-unquote refugee crisis from January 2015 to October 2016. While Reinhard Kleist's An Olympic Dream narrates the tragic story of Somali Olympic runner Samia Yusuf Omar and her premature death by drowning en route to Italy. By incorporating the aesthetics of mobile devices into the very fabric of their comic art, in which mobile devices and social media visually and contextually frame content of both Evans' Threads and Kleist's An Olympic Dream, these artists render smartphones and their social media platforms made available through smartphones as panels themselves. Framing migrant representation through smartphone screens and Facebook posts incorporates the technology of migration into presentations of that experience to intervene in discourses of refugee representation. In the 11 examples of Evans using the handheld device as an explicit frame, the author's cell phone is positioned oversized yet photorealistic in the center of a spread of lace, an important leitmotif featured in the graphic novel's narrative and formal characteristics. Scrapbook-esque clippings of typed text frame the content of the smartphone screen. My phone bleeps into life. Connectivity, commentary, follow the threads of conversation wherever they go. Here, the symbol of the smartphone is positioned as a technology of connections, one that fosters conversation. However, the hate speech that appears on the screen is wholly antithetical to the kind of connective social function that the smartphone supposedly represents. This mobilization of the iconicity of the mobile device establishes a dichotomy that plays out across the graphic novel, in which the signification of the smartphone pendulums back and forth between connection and alienation. In chapter 6, for example, Evans introduces smartphone imagery in the context of the lives of the migrants living in the clay jungle. Named after the main character of the story, Hoshar, the chapter recounts the author's visit to Hoshar's 8-foot shack. After making his guests lunch, the four sit down to play the quote, "Let's show each other our families on our phones" game, end quote. Evans takes the first turn, displaying photos of her family and 2 cats in the UK before Hoshar offers his cell phone to his company, presenting them with images of his mother, father, sister, and her children. Finally, the last panel, which takes up the bottom third of the page, offers a subjective camera perspective as we gaze down at Hoshar's smartphone from his point of view to examine a picture of his family home. This panel series and others that feature this quote-unquote game reveal the important role of mobile devices in archiving and documenting migrant lives. They function as vessels of memories of the homes they lost and entire photo albums of the people, places, and things they value but had to leave behind. Ultimately, through the integration of the smartphone into the fabric of our panel, Evans illustrates how the value and importance of smartphone technology changes depending on the user. With the anonymity afforded by internet forums and the comforting distance of witnessing injustices to the individuals of forced migration via smartphones breeding disconnection, misinformation, and hate speech, the same device in the hands of migrants and refugees helps them connect to the people around them, archive and document their lives, and bear witness to the atrocities that they experience. Turning to my second example, Kleist's An Olympic Dream demonstrates another kind of mobilization of the aesthetics of the smartphone, this time focusing on one of its most preeminent social media technologies, Facebook. Here, Kleist employs Facebook as a framework to offer a narrative exposition on posts that punctuate the narrative, supplementing the images and dialogue within the comics panels themselves with additional information. Kleist text thereby literally draws attention to another digital space in which migrants are archiving and documenting their lives, in their Facebook status updates and their participation in social media. Samia's first Facebook post introduces the aesthetics of the social media platform into Kleist's graphic narrative, in which Samia contemplates her loss at the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing. This post sets up the visual language of social media as an essential element of Kleist's graphic narrative diegesis, informing the reader's interpretation of subsequent posts, which appear at regular intervals throughout the story, becoming an essential aspect of how Samia's story is told, or more precisely, how she tells her story. Very quickly, however, the aesthetics of Samia's Facebook posts shift. While recounting her father's death, Samia's social media engagement exits the confines of the Facebook post box to spread narrative exposition across several pages. Here, the Facebook post takes on a new form that continues to appear throughout the rest of the graphic novel, that of the panel caption. The rhetoric of the Facebook post soon appears both inside and outside social media boxes, as well as in captions running underneath and alongside Kleist's comic panels, with the act of collapsing this essential form or feature with Kleist's aesthetics of the Facebook post, making an important statement about the agency of the protagonist. By making these captions also de facto Facebook posts, the aesthetic of the comic's caption undergoes an important change. The omniscient narrator typical of comics captions is immediately rendered Samia herself. Even if this is only an aesthetic move, Kleist is no longer narrating the story, Samia is. The first-person rhetoric of social media enters into the captions by way of this collapse, making Samia herself the authorial voice of her own story. Considering that refugee comics with the intention to spread awareness for the plight of refugees and humanize these individuals are typically written by people who are themselves not migrants, but volunteers or artists working in the communities, these stories are also typically framed by the artists behind the graphic novels. However, with Kleist's reconceptualization of the comic's caption, the typical object of refugee comics becomes the narrating subject. These Facebook posts in Kleist's An Olympic Dream are in part fabricated, which also makes the representation itself highly problematic. Yet, what is important about this move to incorporate the technology of migration into its representation is that it acknowledges these neglected sites of migrant agency. Even while artists such as Kleist and Evans narrativize and fictionalize some of their content, they're still advocating for and privileging these platforms and technologies, connection, and communication, in which migrants are the agents of their own stories, drawing attention to spaces where migrant voices speak about migrant experience. By developing this new aesthetic of mobility, comic artists are drawing attention to the essential tools of migration, while offering alternative perspectives on migrant experience that moves beyond the conventional categories of refugees as either powerless, infantilized victims or dangerous invaders, positioning them as agents of their own stories and documenting their hardship through the aesthetics of the technologies that facilitate the migrant journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Biz. Thank you for sticking to the time and for sharing your slides with us. And I think there'll be questions afterwards and probably questions for both panelists. So we'll move on to our second speaker, Petros Tsakaliadis. I apologize if I didn't get the name pronunciation right. Petros is currently a fourth-year PhD candidate in the Department of French Language and Literature at the National and I'm not going to get this one either, Kapodistrian, you can correct me in a minute, Petros, University of Athens, Greece. And he's joining us from Athens, which I think is really exciting because our virtual format is really opening up our conference to international scholars. So his current research examines the representations of sexuality and violence as seen in the Francophone Bande Dessinée. His other research interests include gender history, history of comics, cinema, video games, and intercultural comparisons. And the title of his paper today is War, Violence, and Ethnic Conflict in Hajime Isayama's Shingeki no Kyojin. So please welcome Petros.
All right. I hope you can all see my screen. One moment. Okay. So, yes, my subject is War, Violence, and Ethnic Conflict in Hajime Isayama's 2009 manga, Shingeki no Kyojin, which that was also adapted to an anime in 2013, I think. And it's very popular in the West as well, and known as Attack on Titan. So let's begin. First, a few things about the story for those who haven't read it or watched the show. So the premise is this: humanity has been driven to the brink of extinction. It's constantly attacked and devoured by horrifying humanoid titans. And humans have finally retreated behind 3 enormous walls, as we can see here. Okay, so they are surrounded by these grotesque, huge creatures that basically want to eat them. And shutting themselves off from the world, humans are living their lives in fear and anticipation. However, who says that is true? We are presented with this premise. However, we don't have anything to reassure us that this is the total truth of the world. Why should we, the readers and the characters in the story, believe that this is the truth? In fact, it's a very self-serving narrative for the rulers of this world to have this external threat. Like we just listened to a presentation that had immigrants as a theme. And we see here also the theme of the other, the person outside the walls, the borders, who is coming in, and they are presented as monster or something monstrous. And in this case, they are. But without asking the right questions, without asking why is this happening, what's happening here, we will never arrive to an understanding of what's happening in this world. Instead, we just take things at some kind of surface, face value. So the theme of propaganda is very important in the story because nothing can be trusted as total truth, and information is constantly being used by the government to construct ideological narratives. And what's interesting in Attack on Titan is that the protagonists themselves are no different after taking power. There is no easy escape from the uses of propaganda and the desire to utilize these narratives for specific means and ends. Okay, so Isayama is asking, is there a warlike or a political action without a big lie behind it? Can there be such a thing? More specifically, the way the manga approaches the subject of war is very interesting. On the one hand, it's telling us that without courage and heroism, nothing can be achieved. So these aptitudes are necessary in order to achieve anything. But there is a fundamental contradiction here, because for the individual, death is a finite and absolute ending. After death, there is nothing more in the story. So we see that the ideal of courage is constantly evoked by military leaders in this manga to kind of psychologically entrap soldiers into sacrificing themselves for a larger idea or goal. So we see that courage can be beautiful in some moments until, of course, death arrives, which is always presented, as we're going to see later, as a very terrifying and painful thing. So the moment of death. Contrary to most manga, violent death in Attack of Titan is depicted as something horrifically meaningless. There are no romantic or heroic traces left after someone dies in a war. And thus, there are no easy justifications for self-sacrifice. It's a very common theme in many comics and manga. We see some heroes sacrifice themselves, and his sacrifice has some sort of meaning. There's this romantic portrayal. Here, the reality is much different. So even some of the most courageous people faced with the reality of their imminent deaths are frozen, and they react in very sad ways. Similarly, with the act of killing and murder, it's something that's almost always presented as something very messy and very sad. And something crucial here, the series understands that only by dehumanizing the other, either by thinking they belong to a different ethnicity or a group that needs to be, that is inferior or something like that, can someone murder without the act weighing on their conscience. And ending a life leaves a horrific aftertaste to the reader, no matter the victim's moral or ideological qualities. There is not this type of thinking like, oh, this was a villain, we can kill them, and we can kind of feel some kind of heroic justice in that. It's always very messy, very uncomfortable. Similarly with torture, I apologize for the graphic images. So similarly, Shingeki tries to avoid simplistic or moralistic conclusions. And even though we see like the main government is at the beginning, it's trying to basically use propaganda and torture to enforce a fake narrative onto its population. After the protagonists take power, they do the same things. And the main executioner or torturer of the previous king even says to them that you cannot escape this. Like, even if you try to form something new, a new type of government with trying to achieve something different, you have to do this if you want to maintain some kind of order and peace. And he is kind of proven correct by the story. So Shingeki here is not providing any easy answers or solutions. Now, focusing on the theme of racial hatred, which is one of the most important of this story, we already mentioned that the other, in the form of other ethnic groups and the Titans themselves, which we don't know what they are until much later, they are presented as something very inhuman, grotesque, and dangerous. And Shingeki is asking the question, is the idea of the other necessary for any kind of state to exist? So propaganda presents these lies as some kind of natural, reified, natural realities. And there are very real historical allusions to the National Socialism and the immigrant crisis. As I just mentioned, there are very clear historical parallels here. We see here the armband, which is a clear reference to the concentration camps. And concerning the theme of ethnic identity, we see how self-hatred in this story is taught and perpetuated as a political weapon. And we meet characters like the young Gabi here, who accept the official racist narrative about her ethnicity. She actually thinks she is inferior, and she has to somehow prove to the oppressor ethnicity that she's somehow worthy to belong in her society. And of course, the responses of queer ethnic group range from violent revolutionary anger to giving up, to suicide, all kinds of things, all kinds of human responses. But her story is one of the most affecting because it's like how this self-hatred can be taught and internalized by people. And we already mentioned the historical parallels with the Nazi concentration camps. But the crucial thing I have to mention here is that Shingeki manages to tell a very human story in a very inhuman world. So it never feels really misanthropic or unreadable in this sense, because the focus always remains on believable characters, and thus it's making the grand ideological narratives and themes all the more convincing, despite the very dark nature of the series. And lately, the past 5 years, I think, some criticism was leveled against the show because, in some sense, in an understandable way, the historical parallels I just mentioned were judged as too insensitive by some critics. However, I have to say that maybe there is a kind of an instinctive rejection of these very complicated narratives and some kind of learned desire to conform to very simplistic dichotomies that Shingeki no Kyojin rejects, and it's in its effort to complicate everything it touches. However, I have to say that there is some justified criticism that can be leveled at the series because it's never really made clear whether the essentialized racial characteristics of an ethnic group is something real, like biologically speaking in its world, or it's just mere propaganda. It's left up in the air as something that is just never made clear. It doesn't take a stance on that. So to conclude, I have to say that even more than most comics and mangas, Shingeki no Kyojin tries to grapple with and understand some impossibly complex subjects, like I just discussed: propaganda, torture, war, and ethnic conflict. It has some of the most convincing depictions of violent death in comics, and very haunting historical parallels and depictions of racism and ethnic conflict. And maybe the main question it's asking right at the end, and it's what the protagonist, Eren Yeager, represents, it's asking that whether can there be freedom from oppression without violence, or without at least the threat of some kind of violence. So that's all from me.
Thank you so much, Petros. I feel like there's a lot more you could say about this, so I'm glad that we have 25 minutes now for Q&A. Yeah. Both of these papers just blew me away. It's so exciting to start the conference with such in-depth, thoughtful, and sort of philosophical as well as aesthetic analyses. So I'm just really interested to hear you say more about these. And thank you so much for, I think you did set the bar incredibly high. I'm glad I'm not giving a paper at this conference. Okay, so let's open it up for questions. Feel free to type in the chat or raise your hand. We're a small enough group, I have everyone on one screen. So feel free to wave frantically or use the Zoom hand raise. And feel free to ask a question of either presenter or both of them. So would anyone like to get us started? Paul, and maybe I'll just ask you to introduce yourself because I'm not sure everyone knows everyone.
Sure, I'm Paul Malone. Can you hear me? Okay, good. I can't hear anything because I've got my headphones on. I'm Paul Malone. I'm an associate professor of German at the University of Waterloo, and I generally do German language comics. So I want to thank both presenters for their papers. I'm sorry that we're missing the third paper, but it was a good start for the conference, I think. My question is actually for Biz, because she talked about German comics. And I mean, you quite rightly drew attention to the fact that Kleist goes to a lot of work, really, to make his protagonist the narrator, so that it's not his white voice telling her story. And yet you also point out, as he points out, and he's always very careful to point this out, that he's had to fabricate these Facebook entries because any Facebook entries that she herself made are long gone. So he acknowledges that. So in a sense, it still is his white voice. It's essentially sort of in brown face in a way. But he's aware of this problem, and he draws attention to the problem himself. And of course, that raises the question, is that enough? When the alternative is maybe nobody telling this story, is this an acceptable alternative? And some people would say, no, it's still not. It's still not good. That's one thing I'd like you to go into about what you think about that. The other thing that I just wanted to bring up, mention quickly, is that quite often the critiques of frankly racist observers in countries where migration is seen as a threat are that they see these refugees with cell phones, which are at the focus of your work here. And they go, well, if they're so poor and they need our handouts, how come they have cell phones? Without acknowledging the fact that, obviously they're reasonably affordable compared to a lot of other things nowadays, more so in Europe than in North America in many ways. And, they are the equivalent of, I don't know if you've ever seen those old pictures of ethnic German refugees coming west from Eastern Europe after the Second World War, because they were being expelled from the Eastern European countries. And they almost always have their radio on the little wagon they're pulling, these huge radio sets, as they were at the time. And the cell phone is now the equivalent of that, nobody, I don't know anyone who has a physical radio set anymore. I certainly don't own one. We have our cell phones instead of that. And for these people, it's their only access to the world, to the news of back home, to their relatives that may not have been able to escape. And they don't, even reading the newspapers on the kiosks in their or country of arrival may be impossible if they can't read the language. And so, the focusing on the cell phone is interesting because it's something that racist critics also often point at and go, well, these people aren't doing so badly if they've got their little Nokia or their Samsung phone. Why should I give any money to them? So those are just my two observations. Maybe you could react to.
Yeah, those are some really fantastic questions. Thank you for that, Paul. And I was anticipating your fantastic questions. So I'm glad you're here in the audience, because I always look to you for mentorship and advice for both Germanists working on comics. So first of all, addressing the problem of Kleist speaking on behalf and masquerading through the Facebook post as Samia herself, which he does articulate in the foreword to this, as you noted. And I think the work that these artists are doing in the forewords to these comics is so valuable. And so when I teach refugee comics, I always include the forewords, because when the framing doesn't exist, these problematic texts become even more problematic. And he's very uncomfortable with the way in which he had to tell this story. And I think articulating this discomfort is a step in the right direction, all the while still highly problematic. What I think is important about the work that's being done here, while also acknowledging in long footnotes in the article itself about what this kind of discourse does when it's speaking on behalf of migrants, is drawing attention to the ephemeral digital spaces, because one of the Facebook posts isn't fabricated. It was part of the Facebook page of a journalist that was working with Samia. And it was well documented that she did use Facebook, but all of these posts disappear because these digital spaces are not privileged as spheres of witness. And not that I'm advocating for there to be documentation of these private spaces, but there are ways in which the media are trying to incorporate these ephemeral digital spaces into the recounting of these narratives, like using migrant selfies, though for the most part it's pictures of migrants taking selfies as opposed to the migrant selfies themselves. But I think that the work that that some of these artists are doing or drawing attention to, there are these places of agency and we just don't access them and nobody's looking at them. And so let's think about what social media is providing as a platform, while at the same time as a site of surveillance. It's like there's always this ambivalence. It swings back and forth whether or not social media aids migrants in their journey, or where it's an opportunity to surveil this passage and then could then lead to further oppression. So that's just this like really uncomfortable space. Like all of this work that I do makes me really uncomfortable, and I sit with that discomfort because I think that's the only place that meaning comes from. It's very difficult to teach as I perform exactly that which I criticize, talking about migrants as not a migrant in the same sense myself. But yes, so I'm still working on some of that nuance of how I can admire Reinhard Kleist's work because of the way he frames it and articulates it, and still have problems with it. To your second question, I think is really on point. This discourse, this like rhetoric of economic migrants that's sort of touching upon, that there's this prejudice that exists that just because somebody is forced to migrate, is displaced, that they're also destitute. And a lot of them are, but it's a humanitarian crisis that's occurring. It should not be faulted for, people should not be faulted for fleeing due to violence and persecution. Of course, many of them have cell phones and smartphones. That is the primary technology of communication that exists globally. So I think that, again, incorporating these technologies into media representations of that experience normalizes the fact that these tools are essential and ubiquitous. And they're thereby like hopefully diminishing the power of these this economic migrant rhetoric that detracts from the fact that it's a humanitarian crisis. It's not about poverty. I mean, it is about poverty because these individuals thereby become impoverished, but faulting them for having smartphones and not supporting them on that is highly problematic, and it's just sort of a way to circumvent the real issues. So this mobility studies lens, which brings representation and dialogue with practice, helps me think through the migration experience through the tools of that experience, and then through the media representation of those tools.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question for both speakers, but before we go to that, does anyone have a question specifically for Petros? Biz does. Biz and Andrew. Maybe I'll go to Andrew and then Biz will come back to you.
Hi, Petros. I'm Andrew Diman at the University of Waterloo as well. I just got a manga course approved by our undergraduate committee, and Attack on Titan has to be on that syllabus because the students are going to love it so much. So I was very excited and I really enjoyed your presentation. One thing I wanted to talk about in that very self-serving light, but also maybe to pin down some of your arguments a little bit. Do you see the symbolism in Attack on Titan as a universal meditation on othering propaganda, or are there specific commentaries emerging from the sort of alternate universe German-Austrian setting or the Japanese side of production that make it a little more focused?
Yeah, very good question. I think it's both. Obviously, there is something universal here, and I think the story can carry and last the test of time and be popular, as we see it is popular throughout the world, right? In Asia, in the Middle East, even Europe, wherever. However, I like that it uses this very provocative or controversial specificity as well, like the German, the ethno-nationalist Germanic aesthetic, to present its themes. And this kind of complicates and roots the story into our world, in a sense. So it's not just superheroes or something, or aliens or something completely divorced from our reality and telling a story with symbols only. It takes these very real historical symbols to tell a universal story. Like I mentioned a little bit in my presentation, Shingeki no Kyojin came under heavy criticism because of that. Because some people believe that there are some kind of references to Imperial Japan's generals or warships or something like that. So people weren't they didn't have a very clear idea on where the author is coming from. But however, I think the themes speak for themselves. The story speaks for itself, and there is no need for the author to make his stance clear on interviews or any of that stuff that kind of take the mystery away, I think, sometimes.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Andrew. Biz, does your question sort of fit with this conversation for Petros?
A little bit. It's about the aesthetics of the manga visual style a little bit. So it connects. And so I don't know the text. I haven't read it, so forgive me for having that level of ignorance. But you talked a little bit about how the racialization of the characters was not pronounced except for in terms of the propaganda, correct? Was that it's hard to sort of determine what the racialized characteristics are that differentiate.
Yes.
And I have that correct, I hope. And so I was wondering if it was as a consequence of the visual style of manga itself, or if that played a particular role in the ambivalence of that characterization, because it really kind of reduces the differentiation between characters due to the visual language of manga. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yes. So I don't think the visual language of manga plays such a crucial part here, because we do see characters that are considered to have Asian characteristics or African characteristics later on in the story. However, the interesting thing is that there is no clear racial distinction. Like, it's not the white people and the Asian people hating each other or something like that. We see an ethnic conflict, which is most of human history is kind of like this. It's not people of different races or colors fighting each other only. It's also Europeans or African nations or Asian nations, civil wars. We see something like that, and an exterminationist mindset, not based on color, but based on ethnicity, which is something much more ancient, I can say. So we do see, though later on, characters that belong to, that have different characteristics, but it's always made vague whether, for example, the ethnicity that, I don't want to spoil the story now, I don't know for people who haven't read, but there is a connection between an ethnicity and their capability to transform into these titans, these humongous titans. But is this some kind of biological weapon? It is, in a sense, but can it affect only certain ethnicities? So this is the complicated thing. Is it something, an essentialist characteristic of an ethnic race, or is it just a weapon of war to make these people look grotesque, make them through propaganda or through how you use them in a conflict to make them as the scapegoats or these monsters, so to speak. So it's playing with these themes.
Great, thank you for that excellent answer. We have a question in the chat for both of you that's kind of an open one that you might have hinted at already, but Safa is asking both of you, what literary theory or theoretical framework would you use for your study or work? So I'll just throw that maybe to Biz. You talked about mobility studies. Are there other theories or frameworks that inform your work?
So in terms of methodologies, I do a lot of close reading, accompanied by theoretical frameworks. And I love working in European and German studies because there's no particularly disciplinary theoretical framework. We can take from anything that we want for the most part. And so in this particular piece, I drew from mobility studies. It originally was more in dialogue with migration studies, but because I put an emphasis on representation, I shifted to mobility studies, which was really helpful and really put a new perspective on this particular work. So mobility studies is where I'm leaning most heavily in this work, doing a lot of content analysis and close reading, a lot of visual analysis. I'm an art historian by training as well. So
great, thank you. How about you, Petros?
So I'm doing my PhD right now. I will be presenting it in a few months. So the subject of my PhD is representations of violence and sexuality in Franco-Belgian comics. So obviously I studied depictions of violence in art and culture, and but the subject of ethnic conflict was something new to me. So it wasn't something I've written or presented something similar before. I also study and I'm interested in the aesthetic idea of the sublime and aesthetic ideas, literary ideas of the 19th century that I think are not obsolete, as some people I think kind of imply sometimes. So yes, I'm interested in violence, the sublime. I'm interested also in fun depictions of violence in, for example, in shonen manga, the allure of martial arts, tournaments, all these kind of narrative techniques comic artists use to attract readership.
Great, thank you for such succinct responses. And I see Safa is very pleased with your response. So we have another question. I don't know if it's Jaya or Haya, but we have a question for Biz. As researchers in the field of social media, while selecting primary sources for study, how does one ensure heterogeneity or representativeness?
Thank you for this question. And this is sort of what led me to the larger research project. It started with looking at new media representations in comics, because I got tired of listening to people talk about migrant experience and wanted to find ways in which to have these stories told from refugees and migrants themselves, which is why I started turning to more and more new media and collaborative projects. And I recently taught a course on the new media and forced migration, in which I sought to counter all of the narratives of traditional news media through new media sources in which migrant voices were privileged, isolated, or produced in collaboration. So looking to video games that were produced in collaboration, because a lot of these texts, due to the disadvantages of migrant life, it's difficult to often find opportunities to be telling these stories while during the migrant journey. After post-migration life, post-migration narratives are a completely different category of representation. But we're looking at photographers that collaborate in having individuals present themselves how they want to be presented, and doing sort of family photographs in which the refugees themselves are staging their own scenes and choosing from a selection of backgrounds. Podcasts in which migrant journalists, because there are refugees that due to displacement, they're now refugee journalists on the move doing that work. So looking to organizations that are attempting to privilege refugee voices is one way in which I shifted from this particular project. This is where I began. I was just fascinated by all the cell phones in comics. And then I started thinking about cell phones in digital games on migrant experience. And I work a lot on Bury Me My Love, which was based on a WhatsApp transcription of a conversation between a refugee and her family en route to the EU. And that was then modeled into a game in collaboration with that same family. And then I started looking at migrant selfies and thinking about photography. So this is the beginning of my interest. And then I was like, okay, that's enough white people talking on behalf of migrants. And then this project has shifted more, like how can we have refugees telling their own stories? And that's what my class was looking at more of. So thank you for that question. I don't think that I've succeeded in absolute representativeness, as you phrase it, but I'm still trying to work towards it, because that's what I want to see in these kinds of media texts.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions for the presenters? We have about 5 minutes left. If no one's jumping the gun, I have a question for both of you, and it was actually a comment you made, Petros, about the relationship between the individual characters and these larger allegories. And I sort of have a question that's half formed around the difference between documentary comics and realistically representing characters or forming real people into characters, and then the manga that is much more allegorical. But my actual question is, I wonder if both of you could talk about the relationship between the individual and the historical, or the way that your artists are trying to depict geopolitical conflicts or historical narratives through individual stories, and how can they do that without turning their characters into ciphers or types rather than full-blown characters, so that you don't just get a representative of a larger story telescoped into a kind of artificial construct. And I hope that kind of makes sense, but really, Petros, maybe you could start it, because I think your comments, your paper really got me thinking about how can a comics artist successfully gesture to larger narratives, but also retain a sense of the uniqueness of their individual characters?
Mainly it's about writing quality, understanding people, and being honest enough to understand that no matter the grand narrative of your story, if you don't have people, it's going to ring false, no matter what. It's going to ring hollow, because you need actual people that you can connect and understand. So for the larger themes to come into focus, and so that they become universal and anyone can immediately think this is true, this is something that no matter the fantastical setting or the historical period, this is something universally true. This a response or an attitude towards life or oppression, all kinds of things. So yes, I feel that I don't have examples right now, but sometimes I feel that comics that are interested in political or historical realities forget to create characters, because it's kind of an easy shortcut in a sense to have this premise, this very intriguing premise, but I don't think we can escape the fact that you need to create actual people to populate your worlds and give your themes meaning. I actually wanted to ask the very same question you asked Biz. I wanted to ask her, I hope I've covered your question, whether the comics she has presented or other comics that deal with the immigrant experience, whether they deal with these geopolitical realities with history and, for example, the roles that governments play in provoking or creating this crisis. Like, I feel that sometimes it's a mistake to abstract the immigrant crisis from history and geopolitical realities, and to pretend that as if this is some kind of naturally happening event. Like, I'm wondering whether the comics understand or attempt to understand, because it's complicated, it's a complicated world, why that's happening and what are the political stakes here.
So both of your questions are fantastic. Thank you for them. Petros, maybe I'll start with yours. And no, this is one of the criticisms of these kind of comics, because they're talking more about, except for Kleist does focus a lot about Samia's life in Somalia, but it's still flattening these narratives a lot. It's still migrants are migrants, and not as much migrants from individual countries, dealing with a category of different oppressive and oppressive characteristics of those nations and the violence of those particular nations. They're often named, such as in threads, but that's not doing enough work. The goal of these projects, I think, is to humanize these people and their experience, which shouldn't need to be done in the first place. Of course, they're humans. Let's just be taken for granted. But it's to demonstrate their specificity and subjectivity and vulnerability in a way that makes them less of like a big category of people that is undifferentiated. And so to some extent, they're successful at doing that, but they all, at the cost of a lot of the historical, political, and contemporary information about the place from which they're traveling. So that is a great criticism of, I think, most of this category of comics. Though there are comics such as, I think, Open Borders, I have all these comics over here, that work to do a little bit more in thinking about historical contemporary context and political framing. To Candida's question about sort of the abstractive and abbreviated nature of comics and the way it can which flatten individuals and characters into tropes and conventions of themselves. The way I look at comics is how the feature of comics that I think speaks to this best is its multimodal nature. And so the way in which comics can integrate other media to reference other sites of information, can incorporate photography to remind people that, okay, these are humans. I work on history in comics a lot. And so the way that historical documents are integrated into comics, there are always these moments where there's a photograph and you're like, hey, this is a real person. This is a story about that person that is obviously not nearly as nuanced as their lives, but here is a citation to pull you out of the cartooning format, which is really important in particular with refugee comics, because of the anonymity it affords, photography is evidence. Photography can be used against them. Cartooning is a form in which these stories can be told without there being further persecution. So the cartooning and abstraction is essential to having some of these stories be told, but there are moments in which there's other media that are drawn in to demonstrate, okay, these are real stories and real people with real lives. And that's what I think the smartphone does to a certain extent. And you see that in other categories of comics, other genres. They do it differently. In historical comics, they draw documents from the archives, which are super boring, but they're kind of like brought to life. You see a lot of photography in comics on migration. There's even that comic that's entirely photography that I really don't like, but find very interesting. The Crack, I think it's called in English. But yeah, so that's kind of how I see comics doing that work, but not all of them do it well.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We're now out of time, so I'm sad to say we have to end, but the Discord channel is going. I finally managed to get into it, and so I encourage you to keep the conversation going over there. We have a half-hour break now, and then the next session starts at 1 o'clock my time central, whatever that is in your time zone. And I just want to thank everyone for these excellent papers and questions and the responses to the questions. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you in the next session.
Thank you everyone, that was fantastic. Thank you to my fellow panelists as well. That was really great, very interesting.